Good evening, everyone. It's great to have our candidates join us, and I'm happy that the community could also join us. My name is Bonnie Johnson-Ayton, and I welcome you to the EMS Staff and Community Forum. I will be serving as tonight's moderator, and I will be joined by one of our students who is an 8th grader at the middle school, Morgan Davis. Morgan is serving as an active hiring committee member, and also is with us tonight is Tyler Doggett. Tyler is also an active hiring committee member and a parent of one of our students at the middle school. Both Morgan and Tyler have been kind enough to take an active role in asking questions to our candidates. I also want to take a second to acknowledge and honor the diversity that exists in our community. And tonight, our district multilingual liaisons are providing interpretation services for this event for our community members who do not speak English. So candidates, please remember to pause for a second after you've been asked a question so that our team can translate the question before translating your answers. Please help me in thanking the multilingual liaisons and joining us. And I'll give you reminders if you suddenly are talking too fast. I also want to remind everyone that tonight's meeting is being streamed on the BSD YouTube channel, and it's also being recorded. We want to acknowledge that these traditional types of forums are usually held in person, but due to COVID and out of an abundance of caution, the decision was made to host a forum virtually. For those who are disappointed, please accept our apologies. So the hiring committee is also very interested in your feedback. We have developed a Google form, and for anyone who is willing to allow your voice to be heard, the hiring committee will review your feedback before we make any recommendation to the superintendent. This form is available on the Burlington School District EMS webpage. Principal search webpage. We are also pasting a link to that form in the chat access. Please be aware that the submission window for completed surveys will close tomorrow at 2 o'clock. June 8th, 2021. So our format tonight is structured in such a way that all the candidates will answer the same question before moving on to a new question. The reason for this is to allow you to hear and assess their responses. All candidates will be afforded equal time. We will be using an active and visible timer for the candidates to keep their responses within the time frame and ensure equal time. Please be aware that the candidates' microphones will be muted upon the completion of the allotted time period. All candidates have the prior opportunity to utilize this time format with success. Okay, so we're going to jump right in with introductions of our 3 candidates being considered for the position of principal at Edmonds Middle School. So please welcome first Eduardo Sindeco, Sabrina Vestike, and Carrie Wyman. As a reminder, each of the candidates' biographies have been published to the Burlington School District website, the EMS Principal Search. Okay, are we ready? All right, Eduardo, you have the first question. And please remember, try to be as specific as possible and provide concrete examples where appropriate. Okay. First question. Tell us how your professional background prepared you for this position and why did you choose to apply?
Yes. Well, I think the biggest thing for me is I've been a teacher both at the elementary level, and then I've been a assistant principal, and principal supervisor at the elementary and middle school level. And so for me, I think it's really important to understand the role that us as educators play in the life of middle schoolers. And so what I'm most excited about with this role, why did I apply for this role? I think for me, it's being able to work within the Burlington community within the middle school area. And then ideally for me is understanding, starting out as an elementary teacher and then being a principal, and before that, a high school assistant principal, is being able to see that trajectory coming from elementary to middle school and make sure that our students are thoroughly prepared going from the 8th grade into the 9th grade. I think those are the main reasons, what my role as an educator is being responsible for that. I'm really excited about that. And then specifically, why did I apply to the Edmonds School is I think that there's a lot of opportunity to really make the campus and the community a cohesive relationship and being able to bring the campus from good to great. I think that's what most drives me and most specifically I'm excited about within the role.
Thank you. Sabrina, same question. Tell us how your professional background prepared you for this position and why did you apply?
I'm Sabrina Vesdijk, and I am currently the assistant principal at Edmonds. I entered education as my profession because throughout my childhood, my own educational experiences, I recognized pretty early on that schools can be really empowering and can be a site for liberation of young people, or it could choose not to be. And I was really excited about being the type of educator that would empower and liberate students. And so I've worked in a number of schools in a number of states. I started teaching in rural Arkansas in a school that I guess would be defined as under-resourced. And my goal was to create a liberatory space for young people who were very well aware that the system was stacked against them. And after that, I wanted to become more effective at doing that. And so I went to get a master's in education at the University of Oregon, which definitely had a program and a philosophy aligned to school as a space for empowerment. From there, I taught in Oregon, similarly in diverse schools, both linguistically, culturally, racially, and socioeconomically. And I really enjoyed that work. And I started moving more into teacher leadership, which is something I certainly pursued further once I relocated to Vermont in 2012. And so, especially in the most recent years, I moved into helping my schools pursue social justice. Why Edmonds Middle School? I feel like I'm making an informed choice. I really reflected on that for a while, if this was the right space for me as a principal and if I'm the right person for it. And ultimately, I really want to be here in this capacity because I think that both EMS and the district are poised to make a really big leap forward, and I want to be a part of that. I'm really optimistic about the vision of the school and of the district, and I feel like I'm ready to maintain that momentum and move forward together. And I love this. This is my home.
Thank you. Okay, Carrie. Tell us how your professional background prepared you for this position and why did you apply for it?
So I'm Carrie Wyman, and I'm currently the assistant principal of a pre-K through grade 5 building. I never imagined myself at the elementary level prior to this experience of coming on board to where I am currently in the pre-K 5 building. I was a principal for 2 separate grades 3, 4, and 5 school buildings. And I liked that transition to that upper elementary-ish age level. But prior to that, I was actually a middle school teacher for the bulk of my teaching career. So making the transition from middle school to elementary school at first was a little bit challenging. The ideas of how you engage with and support elementary students versus your middle school students can be very, very different. So I used to joke sometimes that I was a recovering middle school teacher and I traded in my middle schoolers who were funny and they always made me laugh and smile for the little ones who draw me pictures and want to give me hugs in the hallway. But my heart is truly a middle school person. Prior to my middle school experience, I taught high school for a little while. And at the high school level, I enjoyed it. And I had the opportunity to work in a rather large high school that had a very diverse population. And I realized that in my time there, I was not as culturally responsive as I hoped that I would be. So I started to dive into that work as a teacher leader. So for me, choosing Edmonds Middle School and the Burlington School Department goes along with my beliefs and my passion around school being culturally responsive to their students and really supporting that diverse demographic. And then, you know, the other piece to this puzzle, why someone from away would be so interested in coming to Edmonds Middle School. My adult stepchildren both live in Vermont still, and I'm married to a native Vermonter. So my 102-year-old grandmother-in-law lives right over in Milton. My stepdaughter and grandson live over in the Northeast Kingdom. So just having the opportunity to be grounded in Vermont and be close to people I love and to be able to work for a place that seems like a beautiful community was really a lot of the driving factors for me.
Thank you. I'll just issue just a quick reminder about slowing down for our interpreters and before I move on to the next question. So we're going to start the next question with Sabrina. So Sabrina, tell us in your view, what does educational equity look like as a leader, and how does it fit into your educational philosophy when applied to teachers?
To me, educational equity means that we are providing the support and resources for all learners to achieve high expectations, regardless where they're starting from. And so not everyone is receiving the same thing because not everybody needs the same thing, but everyone is getting what they need to be successful. When I think about what that means, you know, in the classroom in terms of my educational philosophy, that means a space that's inviting to all learners, that builds trust and communicates respect unconditionally, that sets clear and high expectations and greets all students with optimism, and demonstrates faith in their abilities and value and capabilities. Where educators are working incredibly hard and collaboratively to come up with purposeful learning and culturally responsive practices, collaboration, so that there's energy in the classroom. But I also think that it means that there is a high level of coordination between everyone serving our learners. So classroom teachers are not an island. They're working with our special education team, our EL team, social workers and others to make sure that we wrap around students and get what they need, and that what we are doing with students in different spaces is complementary to advance them towards goals that are shared and clear both to the students themselves and families and everyone who is working to serve them. And when we encounter challenges through an equity lens, we don't explain them through any sort of deficit approach, but our first question is, what can we do differently? What do we not understand about this learner yet? What resources are out there that we haven't yet employed? What more learning could we do? So that equity in the service of our learners and their success is always the focus. Students are always at the center, and we never stop striving to bring our very best every day, while honoring who students are and what they bring and finding spaces for them to actively contribute, and also support one another.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is for Carrie. Carrie, same question. Tell us in your view, what does educational equity look like as a leader, and how does it fit into your educational philosophy when you have applied it to teachers?
Okay. So when I think about educational equity in practice, for me, it's ensuring that we have the systems and structures in place to uncover any inequities that are happening in our system, that we have the necessary opportunities to review information about students to uncover what subpopulations we're underserving. We can't provide students with what they need if we don't know that they need it. And I think some of the best ways that we can do that is when we offer up opportunities for teachers to work collaboratively with looking at information regarding the whole cohort of students, because oftentimes it's not just about their students, right? They might see something in their own classroom and try to address the issue and provide what that particular learner needs for them, but they're not the only ones. And there are going to be teachers in other places that are going to be seeing the same kinds of things. So I think when educators can lean into one another and have the opportunity to do this work together, I think that feels more empowering for the educators. They realize that it's not just them trying to solve this problem or provide learners with what they need to be successful as they move forward. So when I think about equity, particularly for teachers, I view teachers in the same light. I think sometimes we need to provide teachers with what they need to be successful. And that might not look the same for all staff members. So I think as a school leader, it requires us to become the leader that those particular teachers need to help them uncover areas of growth for themselves, or help them set themselves up for success and being able to help their students progress forward and meet the standards and develop those classrooms where students can really learn and grow and be highly successful.
Thank you. Okay, Eduardo, sorry. You have the next question. Tell us, in your view, what does educational equity look like as a leader, and how does it fit into your educational philosophy when applied to teachers?
I think the biggest piece that I have found with educational equity is looking at it from the lens of, assets-based, right? So focusing on what we're doing well. And then from the lens of the teachers, looking at both the academic and the non-academic. So I'll talk about both of those separately and then combine them together. Obviously, first and foremost, we need to ensure that all of our learners are thoroughly prepared for our classrooms. Right? But sometimes our teachers struggle, have a challenge of working with particular groups of students and holistically. And I think the role of the principal is to be there and be supported, be the conduit to provide that leadership, but also provide the tools for them to be successful. But at the same time, right, we can't just ignore some of the challenges that our students are facing on the non-academic sides that bring in those challenges for teachers that sometimes they're not used to in working with that. So in terms of the equity pieces, we help our teachers both on the academic side to provide support for them, at the same time addressing some of the questions and challenges that they're facing and directly providing support on the non-academic side as well, right? Because if our students are coming in with vastly different areas, right? If they're going home and their lights are off or those types of things, we need to make sure that our teachers can handle those pieces, right? So we need to build a bridge in providing the non-academic support for our students, as well as for our teachers in that area. Additionally, in terms of how do those two things align is all those things that teachers are facing within the classroom, we need to make sure that they're thoroughly prepared, i.e. having those conversations, having those equity circles, in thoroughly preparing our teachers to work with our students and providing support for them. I think that's the role of the principal in providing access to giving their tools to our teachers for them to be successful with our students. And that's how I address the equity piece. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tyler to ask the next 3 questions. So Tyler, the floor is yours.
Great. For my question, Carrie, I'll ask you first, and then Eduardo, and then Sabrina. Okay, Carrie, describe your understanding of middle school and the developmental needs and differences of the middle school student. how do you balance the need for academic excellence and social emotional support?
So for me, my understanding of middle school and the middle level is that it's this very exciting time for students as they're starting to gain more independence and they're leaving elementary school, and they have the opportunity to start to engage with and think about where is it that their futures are going. So for me at the middle level, it's a very beautiful time where students are still excited about learning and wanting to engage in the learning process, and they start to be excited about what their career paths might be, right? So when I think about that, but we also have to remember all of those social emotional needs of middle level students who, when they come to middle school, they're not quite ready for all the changes that are happening and the ways that school might look and feel differently, and all the different opportunities that they might have at the middle level that they haven't maybe had before. But also helping students figure out how to regulate their emotions. When middle schoolers are having a rough day, I think it's our job as educators in the building to help support them through those rough days and help them figure out that it is going to be okay on the other side. And we are there to help them. And it's our job as leaders to help them feel safe and secure and become the young people that they truly want to become. So when I think about middle school, I think about laughter and fun and tears and crying. If you've ever been to a middle school dance, you've seen all of the above within a 30-minute period. But it's just, there's so much joy there. And for me, I enjoyed every day going to work with my middle schoolers. So I think if we have an understanding of their needs and we're able to support them academically and emotionally and behaviorally, then we are setting them up for success further down the road.
Great, thanks, Carrie. Eduardo, same question for you. I'll read it again. Describe your understanding of middle school and the developmental needs and differences of the middle school student. How do you balance the need for academic excellence and social emotional support?
I think the first place you start is helping the students determine who it is that they want to be. So I think you start with that. And so that informs your practice in terms of both developmentally and the social emotional needs. In terms of the developmental needs is our students are coming from maybe a one classroom teacher where they're spending the whole entire day, where now they have 4 or 5 classrooms a day after switch. So providing that level of developmental support as well as the social and emotional support. But those two things are interconnected, right? So I remember my experience as both a student and then as a principal at a campus, a middle school campus. And what I noticed was those things are the same, right? You can't separate those two things. So we want to, but as you provide support and helping students be the bridge, be it 6th grade or even 6th to 7th grade, or 7th to 8th grade, is making sure that there's classroom systems within the building and providing support in terms of the developmental needs of being that bridge between one classroom teacher to now you have 6. What does that look like? And providing as well as the emotional support, having those conversations and providing that you front load those conversations because you know what's going to happen and you're creating systems within the building to ensure that that support is there. So what does that look like? Ideally, you would have those conversations over the summer for your incoming 6th graders and you provide support there. And I've done those types of camps and led those types of camps before. Additionally, from 6th to 7th grade and then 7th to 8th grade, it's what are you doing to prepare for middle school, 8th grade, and then what are you doing to prepare over for high school? And having those conversations and that preparation, both from the developmental need and what courses you need to take throughout the levels, but then providing the information that students need to give them a voice so they can express how they're feeling. and providing those sources both at maybe homeroom, right, or during larger sessions with students. I think that's how you address both of those pieces. I think you front load it, you provide support for the students, and you created a space for them to be safe to do that. And then you hear them.
Thank you. And lastly, same question for Sabrina. Describe your understanding of middle school and the developmental needs and differences of the middle school student. How do you balance the need for academic excellence and social emotional support? You're muted, Sabrina.
Sorry, I forgot I'd already unmuted myself. When I think about what stands out for me in terms of the middle school model, I think about how interdisciplinary it is, how focused it is on being exploratory. It's focused on personalization for students, providing them with voice and choice. Everything still feels really open. A lot of students don't necessarily have a sense yet of what they want to pursue in the future. And so the idea is to provide as many opportunities for them as possible to start deciding, who they want to be and what they want to do in the future. I think it takes a whole child approach. Students between 6th and 8th grade really are kind of straddling two different worlds between elementary and high school. And so I think there's still a need for downtime and play. There's a strong need for connection. And so many of those things can be balanced and woven into instruction. It doesn't necessarily need to be a separate approach to building social emotional skills and those kinds of relationships. Although advisory and other approaches like that are really good, it really should be interwoven throughout a child's day, I think. And so regardless of where they are, teachers are building in possibilities for choice and voice. There's opportunities for connection, both to staff and to peers, for navigating relationships, for learning how to handle complex emotions and manage disappointment, manage oneself. But also there's accountability. And I think all of this kind of, as we look ahead to where students are going as they exit middle school, is all about the gradual release of responsibility and making sure that students have the skills that they need, both academically to be successful, but also socially, interpersonally, to be able to navigate the relationships that lay ahead of them, and to tackle obstacles and unforeseen circumstances that they'll encounter as they get older, as they have less support externally. So it really is it's a safe haven that's also designed to be challenging, but within a safe setting.
Thanks. Okay, for my next question, I'll ask it first to Eduardo, and then to Sabrina, and then to Carrie. Okay, Eduardo, if you were hired as the principal, how would you apply restorative practices in the daily operations of the school?
Sorry, I'm just writing down my notes. I think for me, the first thing we need to do instead of restorative practices, I think we have discussions and conversations. So I need to listen and understand where we are as a campus. Coming from the outside, I think I have to determine where we are and having those community conversations. So I would start with the leadership team, working then with our teacher leaders, then working with our students, and then working with our parents to get us a conversation started there. And then I would just do a listening tour. I think the biggest piece is understanding that. Now, that's not going to be a year-long process, but I think, I would look and listen, right? And then learn, where we are. And then I think for me, there is moving forward into leading, right? I think that's the key component of developing those systems. So I'm going to assume that those conversations have already had started based on what I'm seeing from the district website and those pieces. So I'm, again, building from good to great, developing those systems. And then once we start those conversations, what does that look like? So I would look at the strands of students that are being suspended. Are there differences there? And looking at the students in special ed, is there an overpopulation of those students? race, gender, ethnicity, those things. And then you look at some of the other conversations around advanced placement, making sure that our students are being prepared for Algebra 2 by the 10th grade, and how do we build those bridges throughout those systems in terms of the district goals. I think those are the initial pieces that I would focus in on. And then having those more difficult conversations is, how do we feel, how is our campus welcoming, and how are we preparing our students to have those real conversations outside of the academics? So you could address it as well. I was reading a really interesting article recently. It's called the Black Girl Hockey League. And we're really talking about understanding areas that our students aren't exposed to, both socially, but within race and those pieces, and how do we have those conversations, and how we're preparing our students into those different realms, and how are we challenging ourselves through that? Because I think, if we're looking at those types of areas, is we all could stand to learn from each other, because ultimately there's assets in all of us. And when we learn from each other, I think that's the best way. So that's how I would address restorative practices.
Great, thanks. Sabrina, same question for you. If you were hired as the principal, how would you apply restorative practices in the daily operations of the school?
So at Edmonds Middle School, in the past, prior to COVID, there was a lot of work and professional development to tie Tier 1 and Tier 1.5 restorative practices into our school. And so there, were circles and other pieces like that. But I think that a place to start prior to even beginning restorative circles is around how restorative practices really should influence the classroom environment and just daily classroom practice. And so that relates to broader ideas of how do we create spaces that communicate trust and mutual respect, and that establish the ability to enter into dialogue and discourse about challenging subjects, and that respond to things that come up in classrooms that might feel challenging through a restorative lens. So focusing more on processing and repair rather than looking at managing classrooms in a more punitive way, which kind of starts to segue into circles. But for me, one of my focuses, as I've thought about, the year that we have come out of, I think about how to apply restorative practices also when things don't go so well, when students make choices that don't necessarily work well in the classroom or work for their peers or work for themselves. And I would personally like to have an increased focus on how we apply restorative practices in those situations. So reframing behavior through the lens of, how could this be potentially resistance? And recognizing it through more of an accountability perspective, where accountability is not synonymous with punishment. And climate is not about maintaining order so much as maintaining a good, healthy dialogue, resolving conflicts as they arise, because they will, and more of a approach aligned to restoration of relationships, so that students can re-enter classrooms or reestablish connections with their peers and feel like they are still a welcome, supported, valued member of the community. I think that's incredibly important.
Great, thanks. And lastly, Carrie, same question for you. If you were hired as the principal, how would you apply restorative practices in the daily operations of the school?
So for me, restorative practices are a real key tenet to your systems, your multi-tiered systems of support. And to me, I think about restorative practices in terms of how are we implementing these things on a daily basis to connect with our students and connect and provide them the opportunity to build those strong, trusting relationships with the staff in the building and their peers. I think sometimes we get so busy as educators with the educating in the classrooms that we forget the importance of the relationships and that interpersonal connection. And so when students are struggling and they don't have that connection, I think sometimes our restorative actions slip off the radar. So for me, it's about finding out what are the really good restorative practices that are happening in the classrooms and building wide. And how is that modeled for one another as the day goes or as the year goes? How do teachers see other teachers utilizing restorative practices? How are the school leaders implementing restorative practices both with students and staff? I know that for me personally, when you get to the point of being able to utilize restorative circles, I think sometimes staff really appreciate those opportunities to process different challenges that are going on in the building, or when you're thinking about implementing new practices. So for me, it's about how is this implemented with the students, but also how is this implemented from the leadership lens with the staff in the building. I think the more that we're able to model that as leaders and utilize that with our staff, they're going to be more likely to model that and be utilizing those good practices in their own classrooms. So for me, it's a key tenet to that really strong system of supports that we need to have in place.
Great, thanks. I'm going to move on to another question. I'll ask it first of Sabrina, and then of Carrie, and then of Edward. Okay, Sabrina, in what ways will you engage all stakeholders in the education of Edmonds Middle School students?
So I first think about, who stands out to me as stakeholders. Obviously, teachers, students, families, community partners. I think a lot of work has been done in recent years to try to strengthen those communications, not only one directionally to provide information and inform, but to establish two directional communication and dialogue. I think so much of what felt missing to me this past year, as we had COVID learning and decreased access to people in person, was really that piece, was establishing relationships and collaborative opportunities with different stakeholders, including people in the building. And so as we can return to something much closer to normalcy, I'm looking forward to establishing opportunities for students to come together from across the building and across grade levels to help inform decisions that the building's making that impact them, and pretty much every decision impacts them. I'm looking forward to in-person events to gather families while offering also other forums or mediums that might be more easily accessible to families. Also, not just to inform, but to share ideas and hopes and goals for the school and to help shape how we move forward. We are really lucky in Burlington to have such a rich array of community partners that work with our families, and that we can go to also again and again to help provide professional development and supports to our students and staff. And I'm looking forward to finding ways to bring those groups together in person to have meaningful dialogues, and not just to weigh in on ideas that have already been pretty fully formulated, but to actually present them with real dilemmas that we're still actively trying to work through, and asking them authentically and with what I'd say a learning stance to really hear their thoughts and to let that shape and influence our choices accordingly.
Great, thanks. Carrie, same question for you. In what ways will you engage all stakeholders in the education of Edmonds Middle School students?
So community engagement and stakeholder engagement, in my mind, it's the key or the cornerstone to successful schools. schools don't lead themselves, and all the stakeholders need to be moving in the same direction. So when I think about the students and I think about the staff and I think about families, I think it's important to be able to have those informal conversations with them on the fly. And in addition to, all the formal ways that you try to engage families with surveys or opportunities to have meet and greets, which in today's world, in this virtual forum, right, providing them more opportunities just to drop in and say hi. I think that families and community partners have really missed that over the past year. And I think that our students have certainly missed having those opportunities for those people to be in the buildings, for family volunteers, for other community systems that are able to provide learning to our students. So I think finding opportunities once we're safe to do so, and based on comfort levels of many different stakeholders, what are the ways we can start reconnecting as people again? We've spent the past year doing our best to be distanced from one another, and even in our own school buildings to be distanced so we don't become close contacts and things like that, that we hope that we're not going to worry about anymore. But really helping people have those in-person opportunities to be together and celebrate the traditions and honor the culture of the school. So providing those opportunities, and of course, listening to their needs and finding out what are the ways that they want to engage with us. So.
Great, thanks. And finally, Eduardo, same question for you. In what ways will you engage all stakeholders in the education of Edmonds Middle School students?
I think for me, the way I view the school is through as a community hub and a community connector. In terms of, we're looking at the academic supports, but it's a two-way relationship. And what I mean by that is we could work with stakeholders, in this sense, service providers. But I think too often as educators, we look at them as a one-way, what can they do for us, as opposed to a two-way conversation and relationship. Obviously, when our goals are aligned in terms of how are we working with our local banking community, right? How are we opening savings accounts for our students through 529 accounts? Or how are we creating systems of supports for our community provider and helping our parents to connect with classes and using the building throughout the broader day. And then in terms of the academic supports is how are we leveraging the school supports for our students to be able to be exposed to different service providers in a sense of being exposed outside of our school building. And so I think for me, it really is, the school becomes a community hub in terms of being able to connect with multiple service providers. Ideally, as well as they view us in the same way, in a collaborative resource. Additionally, in terms of how do we engage our parents to view our building in that way, so it's a welcoming experience for all. I think those are the main areas. And then how are we leveraging for our students in terms of needs, so i.e. like basic needs, and how are we working with service providers in engagement with our parents, so that, let's say, a food bank, how are we providing food for our families over the weekend? Those are the types of areas of using our community as a community hub and a connector. Because in a lot of ways, we are the one government agency where all of our families are using us on a daily basis. And we have that group of families that we work with, and using those leverages in support of our students, our community providers, and our staff as well. Because a lot of times our families and teacher staff are in need of those services as well.
Okay, great, thanks.
So for this next question, we're going to start with Carrie and then go to Eduardo and then Sabrina. So what is your approach to working with teachers as educators, as colleagues, and as people?
So for me, when I think about working with teachers, my mind immediately goes to when I first became a school leader. For me, I was very surprised that, and I don't know why I was surprised by this, but I was very surprised that I quickly understood that I was going to care about, worry about all the staff just as much as I do all of the students. So when I think about working with teachers, it's about having the structures and opportunities to connect interpersonally one-on-one with them. It's also the collaborative opportunities for us to work in the building as colleagues to move school forward, right? To reach our goals, to think about where we're going as part of the district. So what is the work that we're doing together? And it's also really important, I think, going back to, I mentioned a little earlier on the equity lens, I think it's also important to be able to help teachers become their best selves. I heard a staff member say that in my previous interview. And I feel like that is one of the key roles of a school leader, is to serve their teachers, to help them be the best they can be. And that requires us maybe to understand them as best we can to help them learn and grow in the ways that they want to learn and grow and need to learn and grow. So facilitating meetings, being there with them when they're doing their hard work. I think it's our job as the lead learners in the building to be there side by side with our educators, showing them that we are there to support them and to facilitate the things that they need to make Edmonds Middle School the most successful it can be.
Thank you. And then for Eduardo, the same question. What is your approach to working with teachers as educators, as colleagues, and as people? You're muted. Yeah, you got it.
I got it. I saw the big stick come out. So yeah, I think for me, it's the same thing. I think we always start with how are we working collaboratively? And what I mean by that is, how are all of us working on the same mission and same goal in support of preparing our students coming in from elementary school, and then making sure that our students are prepared. So I think ultimately that's our number one goal. And so working in a collaborative fashion and being a support, and definitely being the lead learner for the group. I think for my area is how are we working in collaboration, and how am I providing supports for my team members? Because I know when I was a new teacher, or even a veteran teacher, when I went to my principal, they were always so supportive of me, and I definitely want to pay that forward. And I think that's how I work most collaborative. I think in terms of when I ask something from our teachers, or when we delegate something to our teachers, I think I always try to, if I'm adding something to it, I'm always going to say is, what can we take off, right? Because if we continue to add, that's where teachers get burnt out. I will mention this, that was my doctoral dissertation on working with teachers. So I'm really passionate about working with teachers and being a support system for them as they transition through their career, and then challenging them and developing that collaborative relationship of that community. Because I think ultimately it's not just about me developing these systems, but a lot of our ideas are coming from our teachers because they are working with our students at the ground level. And so I definitely want to, they're seeing those things on a one-on-one area with those students, and they will be able to come up with solutions or determine next steps much quicker than you would be as a principal, because they're seeing it on a day-to-day basis. And so understanding that and viewing our teachers from that assets-based approach, as opposed to what's wrong with them, why are they not working with our students? And so for me, it's really focused on the supports for success, aligning all of our goals together, and then not being afraid to have those conversations and being able to be there for them as they continue to grow.
Thank you. And then this once again for Sabrina, what is your approach to working with teachers, as educators, as colleagues, and as people?
So I'll speak to this one category at a time that you've named, Morgan. When I think of the staff of Edmonds Middle School, I think of highly motivated professionals who are clearly lifelong learners. So they are always looking for additional resources. They're signing up to participate in staff book clubs over the summer. They are interested in bringing their best selves to students every day. And so I think a school leader is tasked with creating the conditions for educators to learn. So providing those resources, first of all, to fund professional development that is meaningful and aligns with their needs, but also creating the time for teachers to speak to one another and to learn from one another, which is definitely the disposition of Edmonds. And I've seen that over and over again, how open-hearted the staff is to learning from and supporting one another. And so it's about providing that just rich intellectual fodder for them to work with, which they do all on their own. They're really motivated to do that independently. And when I think of teachers as colleagues, I think that really highlights the importance of a principal being a lead learner, that principals are always learning too. And as others have already said, there's so much to learn from the teachers in the building. That is where all of the collective expertise and the institutional memory of a building is housed. And so engaging in the work shoulder to shoulder, I think is incredibly valuable and necessary and incredibly fulfilling and rewarding. So looking to teachers as partners in everything. As people, it's about being compassionate and flexible. Stuff happens, life happens, and teachers need, just like anyone, to feel safe and supported, trusted, so that whatever arises, they know that you're behind them. You've got their back. You're going to support them however you can.
Thank you. So for the sixth question, it's going to go in the order of Eduardo, and then Sabrina, and then Carrie. So what does student-centered education look like to you, and how would you make sure that it happens at Edmonds Middle School? Please give us an example.
For me, I think student-centered education starts with where are we with our students, and what is it that they want from an education. I think then you start from there, but then also the ideas from the teachers as well, because those relationships are really important in middle school. The relationships that students have with their teachers. And so an example of that would be what I've done in the past has been a 3D printing club that morphed into a chess club, right? So an example of that was, there was an idea coming from when I was campus principal, middle school principal. We started with a 3D printing club because the students were really into 3D printing at our campus. That then transitioned to, what can we make with this? And ultimately we ended up making chessboards. And then the students started learning with one piece, became an entire club, and then ultimately ended up being a sort of a collaborative / competition with a local middle school. And to me, that student-centered approach of being supportive with our students started with one conversation with one student, with one teacher, who then brought it to the leadership team brought it to us. And then we worked on, how do we make this happen for our students? And then how do we continue to light the fire over the course of a couple of years? Again, that did not happen over 2 or 3 weeks. That took 18 to 24 months in developing that system. And so being able to foster those one-on-one conversations, because a lot of times you don't know where it's going to go. And so not only being being support, but then how do we get enthusiastically as leaders to being able to support the overall mission of the campus? And I think that's what it means to be student-centered to me. And then making sure that we align everything else that we're doing to making sure that happens in a myriad of different ways. That's one example that I have.
Thank you. So again, this question for Sabrina, what does student-centered education look like to you, and how would you make sure that it happens at Edmonds Middle School? Please give us an example.
I'm looking at this two ways. The first is classroom-based, and the second one is more broadly school-based. So classroom-based, student-centered education, I think, starts with a deep knowledge of students. So not only who they are and what interests them, but also routinely checking in to see exactly where students are in relationship to the goals that have been set, and that students are playing an active role in setting goals for their own learning. And having an active role in choosing which learning modes work best for them, which mediums for accessing information work best for them, so that they are not just passive recipients of learning, that they are actually driving learning and have an increasing sense of agency and ownership over what they're doing. Student-centered learning means that it's inclusive, and that doesn't just mean that everybody's in the room. It means that everyone's in the room with the support that they need to access rigorous learning that will help them reach the standards and the outcomes that will keep doors open to them and paths open to them into the future. When I think about it on the building level, I think about how do we ensure that the decisions that we make are driven by students' best interests. So to constantly say, okay, when we're reviewing this system, or looking at this approach, or looking at our school bell schedule, how is this serving the interest of learners? How is it being built by design to serve their needs? Not just some, but all. And what does that mean? What does that require of us? And so when we make decisions that impact students, they should have a say in that. And adults need to make decisions based on students' best interests rather than resource limitations or the convenience of adults. Students truly have to be our highest priority.
Thank you. And then to finish off just this question with Carrie, what does student-centered education look like to you, and how would you make sure that it happens at EMS? Please give us an example.
For me, student-centered learning is about really valuing student voices, valuing the idea that they can have the autonomy to make good decisions around teaching and learning and the direction that the school is going in. I think about the opportunities for not only students to make decisions around the way they learn best, or perhaps activities in their own classrooms, but even along the lines of student wellness. We really need to be listening to what are the needs of our students on the academic level and the social and emotional level. So providing them with those opportunities to personalize their learning, to be able to reflect and think about where they want to go. When I think about my students as a middle school teacher, that was always an integral part of every unit I taught, was giving students opportunity to choose how they wanted to show their learning and let me see their understanding of the concepts. So for me, it feels as though this can show up anywhere you allow it to show up. So if you're really open to listening to students and what direction they want to go in, you can craft that around any mandate, any standard you might have to implement. I think about a couple of my 5th grade students this year who wrote an essay about something they wanted to change in terms of recycling in the cafeteria. So these 2 girls decided they would create a presentation and came down, and we set up a time for them to do the presentation here in the office. And they were feeling very passionate about this. So I suggested maybe they wanted to do this presentation for food service, for the food service department, and really think about implementing this change. So I think that there's opportunities all around us to allow students to see that their voices are valued, and we believe in their abilities, and that they really do have the autonomy to help drive how schools run and work. And they need to, because that's why we're there for the students.
Thank you. So for question number 7, we're going to go with Sabrina first, and then Carrie, and then Eduardo. So Sabrina, as principal, you will be responsible for promoting diversity in the school. Can you give us an example of how you would tackle the issue of diversity to improve the school culture?
I think about how we communicate respect for diversity. And I think that shows up in a lot of different ways. It focuses on examining our approach to instructional practices and whether or not that is truly inclusive and culturally responsive. That's true for how we approach assessment. It's true for how we ensure that the exploratory and extracurricular options and activities that we host and offer really do address the varied interests and needs of students, looking to see how we support students both inside and out of school to make sure that they can access things as fully as possible. It has a lot to do also with our curriculum. Is our curriculum representative of the diversity in our building? And there's a lot of different approaches to do that. One specific example that I have used in the past is around an equity audit, specifically equity of representation in the content that we teach, whether that is literature or what we choose to focus on as we teach lessons throughout history and so on and so forth. How are different identities being represented, and in what context are they being represented? There are a lot of really pervasive overarching narratives that it's really easy to slip into as a building, that there are a lot of different tools to help us identify and surface so that we can do something about it. And that was ultimately the outcome when I helped to lead an equity audit of our curriculum in a previous district that I was in, is we recognized that there was not representation of diverse voices. We sometimes had figures that were very well known or maybe really common choices, but not some of the ones that were actually maybe more authentic representations of different perspectives, both in terms of racial identity, LGBTQ, socioeconomic status, that we realized we could do a much better job, and we started making changes in what we taught and how we taught it. And again, including community members and stakeholders in helping to make those choices.
Thank you. So next we have Carrie. As principal, you will be responsible for promoting diversity in the school. Can you give us an example of how you would tackle the issue of diversity to improve the school culture?
I believe that when it comes to supporting and really implementing diverse, I'm trying to think how I want to say this. So for me, it's really about modeling the work that I do as a leader with a lens of equity. So that means ensuring that the support systems that we have in place are really meeting the needs of those learners that we need to make sure we take the time to identify and uncover so that we can support them. And that we're actually taking that next step of not just honoring our diverse populations, but we're also being responsive to them. We are honoring their presence in our school, but we're also responding to their needs. When I think about an example of working with an equitable lens in my experience, in the past year, I've been working with a small team of teachers, and we have been attending a cultural competency institute. And here at the elementary level, I think a lot of teachers questioned if it was worth doing an equity audit of the curriculum, because they really couldn't see how that could help them become more culturally responsive. So we started with just an audit of read alouds. So what does your read aloud collection look like? Does it represent a diverse population? So as we worked through that, there were some teachers that had really, really diverse representation of many different groups. Other teachers really didn't have any. Their read aloud collection looked very similar. So I think sometimes it's about starting to uncover the little bits and pieces and help the staff see how you lead in that direction and to help them feel supported in moving in that direction. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And then lastly for this question, Eduardo, how, as principal, you will be responsible for promoting diversity in the school. Can you give us an example of how you would tackle this issue of diversity to improve the school culture?
Yes, I think I'll tell you some of the work that I've done in the past and I'm currently leading in my district. I've done the Everyday Anti-Racist. It's a book that is really great, and I've used it in the past in terms of leading conversations at the school level. And you could use it, I've used it at both elementary, middle, and high school, and used it with my principals as well. I think I would say this, that's a really great book to bring to PLCs, but also have conversations of providing the diversity lens in helping teachers build their relationship within their classrooms, because then they can bring these same tools and use that same protocol with their students. I think that's one of the ways I've done it in the past and I'm currently doing. Additionally, I'm currently leading, we call it an Aspiring Leadership Cohort. I'm working on the team, and what we're doing there is integrating diversity training and also looking at our diversity practices for hiring teachers in that process. I think the big key here is making sure that we're working through an equity lens and looking at all of our practices, be they hiring practices, teaching practices, even budget. How are we spending our budget? And making sure there's an alignment between what we say we want to do and where we're spending our money. So another example that I can think of is looking at what does our diversity makeup look like in our after school programming, right? Who's come into those programs? Why we have certain students. And then in our advanced placement class or our special ed classes, what does the budget look like there? Because I think ultimately we are ultimately judged by our outcomes, yes. And it's fair. I think we also need to address it from the perspective of how do we fix the system from within the system. And lastly, I would say, looking at, like I'm echoing what others have said, but looking at what are our teaching practices and do the materials that are placed in front of our students, are they pushing our students to think, but are they, when they're looking at the materials that are in front of them, does it look like them? And I think those are the main key pieces of how to connect. So again, looking at it from everyday anti-racism and providing training for that, teacher hiring practices and support systems, and both at the budget level and at the academic level.
All right. I have the last question. We've heard a lot from you, which has been great. Thank you. And the last question, by now I'm sure you figured out the pattern, but I'll take my cues from Morgan and Tyler and let you know the order. So we're going to start with Carrie, then Eduardo, and then Sabrina. So the last question for you tonight is, our school district is lucky enough to have a special education director who monitors student services. However, the director is responsible for multiple buildings and generally is not involved in day-to-day services provided to our students. As principal, how will you ensure that students with disabilities are receiving the services they need? And how would you support special ed teachers in their work?
I really appreciate this question, Bonnie. As a brand new school leader, I remember being so excited not only to be throughout the entire building, but to be able to attend the IEP meetings, to see the students working in the different settings, to be able to support learners that were in a vast array of different places in their journey at school. From self-contained programs to autism programs to students that were working in the resource room. I think it's important to get to know all of our students, and supporting our special education students and making sure that their programming is being implemented is really important as a school leader. So for me, it's visiting the classrooms, taking time to get to know those families really well, because they're often in need of many different support services that we might have in our buildings. And we also need to have, not only do we need to have trusting relationships with all families and students, but I think sometimes these families struggle to build the trusting relationship because they want to know that we are going to do what's best for their child. This is their baby, and depending on what their disability might be, I think sometimes it's hard for parents to really believe that we want to do what's best for their child. But I believe that that is the purpose of the team. We're there all together in the same mission to love and care about their children. So attending those meetings, talking with parents, visiting students, visiting the classrooms, and supporting the teachers in the implementation of the programming and whatever that might look like in any setting, whether it's the special education teachers as they're managing their staff, or it's in the regular classroom and those teachers figuring out how to layer in other supports for those students. So
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Eduardo, you're next. Our school community or district is lucky enough to have a special education director who monitors student services. However, that director is responsible for multiple buildings and generally not involved in the day-to-day services provided to our students. As principal, how will you ensure that students with disabilities are receiving the services they need? And how would you support special ed teachers in their work?
I will start right there with the teachers. I think, again, the focus we need to see is having those conversations, making sure that the special ed department and then provides the materials for the homeroom teacher and being able to have those conversations. So all the teachers, when those students get pushed into those classrooms, making sure that the teachers have the tools and provide that training at the beginning of the year. And then making sure that the students are I would say pushed, but I would say facilitated into the rest of the classroom, making sure that, so on classroom visits, making sure that the teachers are asking questions in terms of observations, making sure that the lesson plans are in alignment and the same sort of materials are being exposed, within the IEP goals. And then moving on from that is in terms of the IEP conversations and relationships, being thoroughly engaged in those conversations to make sure that when we have those meetings, what I've done in the past is being able to say, yes, the last time I was in the classroom, wasn't 6 months ago, but having those conversations within the last 2 weeks, I saw that child being able to do these things. So having those conversations. Furthermore, from there, I want to make sure that when we're going outside of the school building, that the students are being have access to the same types of developmental field trips and those pieces to support them, because I want them ultimately experience that. What I have seen the best practices are teachers that go that expose their students not within just the special ed classroom, but within the broader classroom as a whole, in terms of like mainstream, or in addition to being exposed outside of the classroom. So I think those are the main areas. And then within a broader perspective, having those conversations with the leadership team, making sure that, you know, when assessments coming up, they are provided with the supports that they need. And so the students are successful with that process. And then ultimately having those conversations with, you know, as our students are prepared for high schools, making sure that bridge is provided for them as well. Because that success doesn't just end with us. That ultimate success is when they graduate from high school and go on to college. I think that's how I measure success for our students.
Thank you. All right, Sabrina, you will have almost the last word. Our school district is lucky enough to have a special education director who monitors student services. However, the director is responsible for multiple buildings and generally not involved in the day-to-day services provided to students. As principal, how will you ensure that students with disabilities are receiving the services they need? And how would you support your special ed teachers in their work?
At Edmonds this year, the special education team was one of the teams that I was assigned to provide supervision and to partner with. And I have worked extensively with that team this year. I don't know how involved administrators often are with the inner workings of special education, but I suspect I'm a little bit more involved than is usual in that not only am I an LEA, so I attend eligibility meetings and team meetings and reevaluation meetings, but I also routinely meet almost on a weekly basis with our SELM, our special education lead mentor, which is a wonderful way to understand what's happening and what needs are not being met within the special education team. And what I say, or what I mean when I say that, is that special educators need partnerships to do the work. And our special education students need a lot of partnerships and support and coordination. And I think that's one of the key areas that I would be working on as a principal, is to improve that coordination and collaboration and partnership between special educators and classroom teachers, and in some cases with our EL teachers. Another way that I support both our students and our special educators, another role that I play this year is serving as an advocate when students need resources outside of our building. So we have a number of community partners that we contract with to help us, sometimes with behavior plans or other services to lend additional support for students who need it. But it's a limited resource. And so it's incumbent upon the principal to advocate for the needs of students in the building. However, I think it's also important to define our students more broadly. It's not just students at Edmonds Middle School, it's also placing in perspective and going to these same partners and making sure that there is equitable access and that students across all of our buildings are getting what they need. That's a broader and more sustainable definition of advocacy, I think, for our special education students.
Thank you. All right, I want to thank all the candidates for your time tonight and the community folks who are watching us. So on behalf of Morgan, Tyler, and myself, and the whole principal hiring committee, I thank you for your time. And I would also like to thank the parents and the students and the teachers who I think are watching or attending. And I want to remind you that we do have a Google form that we would love it if you would fill out. And I think I mentioned earlier when we first started that the Google form was in the chat, but this Zoom meeting does not have a chat function. So if you go to the BSD website and look under the EMS search, principal search, you'll find the Google form. So that's where that is. And I believe at this point, I can say good night to all of you. I wish you great luck, and you will hear from us at some point soon. Thanks so much.
Perfect. Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Be well. Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, Morgan.
Are we good to head out?
Yep, you're good to go.
Thank you,
Thanks
Morgan.
so much. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Morgan. Have a good night.
Yes,
You too.
thanks. Chris.
We're still live on YouTube, Chris.
Meeting. What's happening?
Thank you, Bonnie. Nice job.
So are we still live?
I just shut down YouTube.
It still says live.
Yeah, it does.
Still live on the Zoom.